Hello and welcome to the Nirvana Principle Show. I'm your host, Dr.Hassan Mallick. I'm a trainee psychiatrist and electronic musician based in Northwest England. I'm passionate about making mental health concepts more accessible to the public, create conversations around psychology, and change perspectives on topics ranging from philosophy to psychedelics, aging to motherhood. I have the privilege of hosting this space on the first Wednesday of every month from 5 to 6 p.m. on Melodic Distraction Radio. Every episode has a featured guest to share their views, opinions, and expertise with us. Our guest for today is Dr.Mischa Mockett. He's a consultant psychiatrist in child and adolescent mental health services. He spends his time working with the intellectual disability population, and he is also the training program director for the Northwest for the NHS. Welcome, Dr. Mockett.
Hi, Hassan.
So thank you so much for taking your time out today. I was hoping that we can talk about autism and how different disorders develop and how it changes the brain. Also a little bit about how autism is in the current society, both locally for us in the UK as well as globally. And lastly, what you can tell individuals who do have a loved one or they care for someone with autism or who might feel they have autism themselves, how they can approach services and what they can do to help someone.
Yes, no problem. I think that's really important and something really important in society at the moment, particularly recently with the effects of COVID and what's going on in mental health.
So, Dr. Mockett, autism has been something which has been part of society for a while, I think around since 1943 when it was first described. And the vernacular has changed. It's gone from autism, Asperger's, autism spectrum disorder. Can you explain what is the current understanding and definition of autism?
I'd like to say, Hassan, yes, so the first formal descriptions of autism started to come out in the 1940s, but autism as a condition, if you read any historical literature, any books, has always been there and has always been, part of society and has always been a condition. It has changed in psychiatric terms and diagnostic terms, and that we kind of have this dimensional trait approach to a group of conditions that we call neurodevelopmental conditions, and autism spectrum disorder being one of those. So you're right that we started to have these descriptions about people who had difficulties around their social communication and social interaction that were described in papers and research in the 1940s. Then this kind of took off again in the 1980s, where child psychiatrists began to use those descriptions to group together young people with difficulties that are impacting on their life. And the importance about this is to understand that these descriptions, conditions, diagnoses are only really relevant if they are impacting on a young person's life, and then they become useful to them. Otherwise, I don't think they're massively relevant, that they're part of a spectrum of disorders for young people that have always existed in the human population, and their relevance is about helping to support young people. So when I talk about neurodevelopmental conditions, talk about autism spectrum disorder, talk about learning disability, talk about learning difficulties, talk about communication disorders, talk about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, that fits in this dimensional trait paradigm.
Okay, so you mentioned a few things. When you said social communication, does that mean something like, for example, if someone cannot physically speak, is it difficulty with language? Is it difficulty with understanding the social cues that we have?
As you talked about, the initial descriptions of autism were young people with no effective communication. So no effective language, no effective communication in eye contact, facial expressions. What we would now class predominantly that is learning disability, severe learning disability, where you have no communication and task-wise, you find it very difficult to complete daily living tasks, or you can't complete daily living tasks. And that's broadened out with this autism spectrum to include people whose intellectual functioning, we call that, so their understanding and a lot of their tasks would fall pretty much in the normal range or the lower normal range for IQ, but have significant difficulties around their social communication, how they talk to people, how they interact with people, with a number of other symptoms too. So it could be rigid, repetitive behaviours, it could be sensory sensitivities, behavioural difficulties as well. So again, it's this spectrum that begins to impact on you.
I mean, autism, even for me as a psych trainee, sometimes gets a bit confusing. Can you tell me what exactly someone with autism suffers from? What is the world like for them? How would they interact? How would I know someone has autism? What would they present as?
So, I mean, what the things you're looking for if you're looking whether someone's on the autism spectrum, you're mainly looking for difficulties around social communication and social interaction. Okay. So social communication, what does that mean? That's about people who have difficulties interpreting both verbal and non-verbal language, so understanding gestures, understanding tone of voice, and then that may be reciprocal, so they have difficulties again with their gestures and their tone of voice and what they're doing. So, and other factors of that could be that they take things very literally. They don't understand, they're not clear at understanding abstract concepts.
Yeah, so if I say, that's cool, it's like, no, it's actually hot today.
Yeah, so they can be very, very literal, things like that. And particularly within English, we've got lots of those things, such as it's raining cats and dogs, which means it's raining very hard. But, to an autistic spectrum person, they may look up in the sky and think, well, there are no cats and dogs coming down, it's just rain. So things like that. Processing information, so having difficulty or being a bit slower in processing information, verbal information that's being given to them, answering questions. They may be quite repetitive in their language, and we call this echolalia, so repeating phrases, stop responses. What we'll often see with children and young people is repeating lines from TV shows and that kind of thing. So that's social communication. Now, social interaction is about how you interact with another person, recognizing and understanding their feelings, recognizing their intentions. So social interaction, we're not taught social interaction, we just pick up on that, and it's an innate thing. So how close you are to somebody, how you use facial expression when you offer somebody comfort and support, all of those kind of things. Now, people on the autism spectrum can have difficulties around those, so forming friendships, supporting, comforting others, seeking support and comfort themselves, and not clearly understanding their own social and emotional needs. They can have difficulties around that.
So empathy is a challenge.
Empathy can be a challenge. Now, remember, every person on the autism spectrum is different. Every person on the autism spectrum doesn't necessarily have all of these. So if you say, oh, well, I can do this, but other factors, so I can't be on, that's not true. Every individual, it's the amount that this is beginning to affect your living and daily living skills. Additionally to that is this restricted, repetitive pattern of behaviours. So this can go again, is a broad spectrum. So you can go to doing things again and again and again. So people on the autism spectrum will continue to enjoy things like flicking a light switch or doing a certain movement or flapping your hands, repetitive, comforting action. Developmentally, children go through that and go through that process, but generally that developmental phase moves on. But people on the autism spectrum can continue with that. And this can then follow into play. So play can be very restricted and repetitive. So lining up cars, lining up toys, ordering them without imaginative play. So they're restricted in the amount of imaginative play, and it's repetitive play. Play may be very copied. Play may be very copied from TV shows, cartoons, things like that. And the problem with this is then people can become quite distressed when these things have changed. So if you're in a routine that you have to do of going to school in a certain way every day, or getting dressed in a certain way, or eating your food in a certain way, and then you become quite distressed if this has to change. Into adult life, people can be very restrictive and repetitive in their activities. So you tend to find more autism spectrum disorders, say, who may be in the train spotting community. That's not to say everyone is on the autism spectrum, but, quite restricted, repetitive behaviours, doing again and again and again, things like that. So a number of celebrities and people now admit to, having been diagnosed with the autism spectrum, again, to be useful to them and identify where their needs are, and it may well be quite supportive to them. It may be quite good for them doing that, and maybe something in their careers, but it can be a problem as well. Sensitivities exist too, such as sensitivities around light, taste, texture, smells. So people on the autism spectrum disorder may not be able to cope with crowded places, noisy places, noisy restaurants, smelly places like restaurants. They may become quite distressed by those. Certain types of clothes, certain types of clothing, how it fits, how it feels, its colour, again may cause issues and can cause difficulties for them. Problem behaviour that can come out of that is where people have meltdowns and can't cope in those situations, and then it can affect their mental health, such as anxieties, and affect their moods. So, it's really important to identify that it is autism spectrum disorder and autism spectrum disorder conditions that are leading to that, to being able to address those difficulties properly, such as anxiety or behaviour problems like meltdowns.
Yes, so it sounds like something obviously which is quite difficult for the carers and loved ones as well. I think understanding what's going on and why someone is reacting like this.
Exactly. So this is the importance of psychoeducation. And, it's where things are imposed. So if you're imposing on a child who has a sensitivity to a school jumper that they have to wear a school jumper, but it causes them significant difficulties around its touch and feel, they're going to have a meltdown and have problems with that. But, you may have rules that impose that. If you're imposing on somebody in a work environment that they have to work in a noisy, crowded place with lots of light, again, that may significantly affect them more than others. So it's those societal restrictions and difficulties that are going to now be imposed that cause problems, whereas historically you may well have been able to avoid that kind of thing and been able to, not have that imposed on you. But, society's rules and regulations mean that, these things may be imposed on you, but you, as an individual on the autism spectrum, may find extreme discomfort and distress from those.
So my understanding of learning disability is that the IQ is below what would we consider quote unquote normal, or which would not be an average intelligence. Is there a number?
Yeah, so I think again, I've said normal, and normal's the wrong word, isn't it? Normal it's average intelligence. Every person is individual. Okay. Now, intelligence itself is what we describe on a bell curve, a normal distribution. You can imagine what a bell looks like, it's on a bell curve, and some people are super intelligent, some people have very low intelligence, but the vast majority of people are in the middle of this bell curve, and that's done by a set of psychometric tests, usually by clinical psychologists, educational psychologists, that put you within this bell curve. Now, this bell curve can be changed for a number of reasons. It can be changed about, how you grew up, where you grew up, cultural factors, genetic factors, but that's how we predominantly class intellectual disability, learning disability, about where you come on this bell curve. And this bell curve is it is reflected throughout humans in the fact, bell curve is the same for height. So, you follow a bell curve for height as well, how height's distributed for people.
So there's a wide range, and like you said, the intelligence itself, which is basically our ability to understand or carry through tasks in a given, or be able to rationalize certain situations and adapt to them. I think the number is 70 and below is when you go into the learning disability spectrum.
Yeah, so formally in the diagnostic terms, we have this distribution of IQs, and on this bell curve, effectively, what they have a number which is called a full scale intelligence quotient. And the number that's been cut off, the official number that's been cut off on this bell curve is 70. And then it's split into categories below this. Now, this is slightly changed in modern diagnostic terms because bell curves can shift. So different cultures, different societies, bell curves can shift. So what they're now saying is around the second percentile. So the second percentile is out of 100, out of an average 100 people from that population, who is below in the lowest 2 percentile.
Playing devil's advocate here, why would it matter if someone has a lower intelligence? As in, why is it important enough to have its own field of study?
Unfortunately, if you're on the lower end of that bell curve, you are more susceptible to other psychiatric conditions. Now, the variety of reasons why you may be in that lower end of that bell curve. It may be a hereditary factor, it may be genetic factors, maybe factors that affected you in birth. You could be born premature, something could have happened during the birth process. Those young people are unfortunately more susceptible to other conditions in doing that. And then they're also more vulnerable in the community because, these young people are at the lower end of the intelligence quotient, therefore that they're more vulnerable to exploitation, having difficulties, having mental health problems in the community. So those young people do require extra support in doing that. Also, schooling can be an issue. They can struggle in a school environment without additional support or in a mainstream school environment. So as much as possible, they try to support that. And I can talk a little bit more about the school process if you want me to explain a bit about that.
Yeah, please.
So within the UK, we have something called special educational needs. Special educational needs covers a broad variety of conditions, including the neurodevelopmental conditions. So not just autism spectrum disorder, not just learning disability, but a wide variety of conditions. Now, each school should have a designated special educational needs coordinator who helps young people and children with educational difficulties. Currently, in the UK, around 12% of young people are said to have special educational needs. And this can be for a variety of factors, as you said. So this could be additional learning needs, this could be emotional needs, this could be for emotional problems. Now, the biggest grouping within this group of people is people on the autism spectrum disorder, because, over the years, and I said since the 1980s, people on the autism spectrum disorder have been highlighted as the biggest group requiring additional support within school. The most vulnerable and the most needy of this group then can go on to have something called an educational healthcare plan. So an educational healthcare plan then allows additional support to be put in by school. If you're on the special educational needs, the SENCO and the class teachers assist you in class and put in additional support. If you have an educational healthcare plan, then you can receive extra support from the local authority, and it can also allow you to access specialist schools. So there are a number of specialist schools that may help people with behaviour disorders, may help people with autism spectrum disorders, may help people with learning disability. And I think this year's number of educational healthcare plans is about 3.7% of school-aged children receive educational healthcare plans in the UK. This is what I'm talking about. These conditions are only important if you require the extra support, and extra support needs to be put in to support you.
So how does that pan out, as in what are the outcomes once this support is given? How do you measure whether it is effective or whether it's improving quality of life or education?
So educational healthcare plans, if you do have a full educational healthcare plan, this then can continue up to the age of 25. Okay, so you can get additional educational support up to the age of 25. 12% being on the special educational needs rate is a big number. It's a big number of children, so for different needs going down, and it depends on what different needs you have. So it can mean, you have additional support going into college. There'll be a special educational needs department going into college. Young people within that 12% are going to end up at university and are going to end up in university placements. So, again, there is access to support from the pastoral care at universities and provisions being put in. And this could be a variety of things. So this could be reading difficulties, this could be dyslexia, this could be people on the autism spectrum disorder, that then can get additional support throughout their educational lives to give them the best possible opportunities going forward. Additionally, as we said, there can be young people who don't have verbal skills, who are really struggling, and their transition would then be into what provision they're going to get and what care they're going to get in adult life. And that generally that comes via the local authority through adult social care.
I wanted to talk a little bit about what you mentioned, learning disability versus learning difficulty.
Learning difficulties itself doesn't have a specific definition. As I've said, on those, that bell curve, it's under the second centile, so 2% of the general population will meet that criteria for learning disability. So as I said, schools identify around 12% of young people with learning difficulties. So if you're on the special educational needs register within a school, you have learning difficulties. So that could just mean you have specific reading difficulties. That could be an emotional difficulty. That could be attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. That could be a behavioural disorder. So those young people would be classed as having learning difficulties rather than learning disability. And you see that there's a massive difference in numbers if you think 12% to 2%, that's a big difference in numbers. But those people are those officially classed with learning difficulties that are getting additional support within the educational setting.
So learning difficulty then does not necessarily have anything to do with intelligence. It is what it sounds like, that there's difficulty in learning new information.
Exactly. So you can have a specific difficulty about your reading, what we call dyslexia, but that would be classed as a learning difficulty. But your intelligence, your general intelligence could be, well within the normal range. You could have a specific difficulty with coordination, which we call, developmental coordination disorder, which could affect your writing or your fine motor function. But that then would class you as having a learning difficulty. But again, your general intelligence could be, within that average range.
Part of the narrative that I grew up with, there's a lot of controversy, I would say misinformation about the causes of autism as well. with his, whether it's genetic in terms of that if you have autism, your kids will have autism. There's some controversy around vaccines, specifically the measles vaccine as well. What do we know about what causes autism or what makes it more likely for someone to have autism?
All the neurodevelopmental conditions that I talked about are highly hereditable. Okay, so what I mean by that is they can run in families, and there is definitely a genetic component to them. So, different statistics, and if you look at the statistics, I can't quote them today, but if you look at the statistics, there is a hereditable factor to them. We definitely know that. We know from historical literature and historical work that these conditions have always existed. So they've existed before modern vaccines, and they've always been in society. If you go back and go into literature such as Charles Dickens or other writers, I've read Tolstoy and things like that, you can tell people on that who would now be classed as being within what we would class as being in the autism spectrum. So, literature gives us that snapshot and that insight into that. So we know, these conditions have always existed before the scientific process of psychiatry has come to the fore in classifying them. Vaccines, the vaccine debate, I think was late 90s, early 2000s, that there was a link made between certain vaccines and the growth in autism spectrum disorder diagnosis, particularly the measles, mumps and rubella vaccine. I mean, scientifically, this hasn't been proved. There isn't a significant link. If you look at different societies, you look where MMR vaccine isn't used, there is no difference, with the prevalence and the increase in the number of diagnoses, whether MMR was there or was not there. Other factors that we clearly know at play are problems with difficulties with prematurity, difficulties with birth problems, conditions that may affect you. We know that certain genetic conditions, you have an increased likelihood of having conditions such as autism spectrum disorder. There isn't a clear link between them. There's a link between them, but you can't do it on a straight line. This leads to this. It doesn't work like that. Unfortunately, genetics isn't up to that point yet where it can make that clear link. So we call it something that, it's a genetic environmental factors that lead to the development of these conditions.
A lot of times, like we say that, let's say diabetes or cancer or heart disease runs in families, it doesn't mean if, for example, unfortunately your dad has heart disease or had a heart attack, that you also will definitely have heart disease or heart attack. You're more likely, you might have to lead a healthier lifestyle, but it's not written in stone.
It's not written in stone. Now, some genetic conditions, as I've said, that are highly hereditable, that geneticists can now pick up on, make it much more likely. So if there is, and some young people on the autism spectrum will have genetic testing and these genetic conditions will be picked up, and it may well be that these are very hereditable, and then what is recommended by the geneticist is genetic counselling about your risk factors of having a child with autism spectrum disorder. Where autism spectrum disorder runs in families, again, it's a mixture of factors between genes and environment, and it's a little bit of understanding and preparation for that, about how that's managed and how that's managed with families. Say, having an autism spectrum disorder doesn't then stop you from going on to university or doing other jobs. It's a spectrum. So, that's got to be understood within that process.
I noticed when I was working with yourself that there seems to be an increase in cases, and there's quite a workload for diagnosing individuals with autism. We have quite a big waiting list of people to be assessed. What can individuals who do feel that they or their child might have autism, how can they get help, and what kind of help is available?
Across the UK, it's very patchwork about how you get your assessment. Children and young people, it's generally easier to get an assessment than it is in the adult population. And it depends which, generally, The assessments are carried out under the National Health Service, so come under the medical sphere. Some areas may conduct them in the educational sphere, but generally it's the National Health Service. Diagnoses-wise, again, that group of people has increased. So autism, young people on the autism spectrum have always been there, but we've not classified it in this way. So historically, when I worked with adults, in very different language, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, when young people were dealt with or managed. And I look at the medical records now, and there's just a broad criteria of educationally subnormal, and you could end up in a specialist school. Now, again, this is fairly broad, so this could be people with learning disability, this could be people with being on the autism spectrum. So when I've seen this classification for people who are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, who historically as children were just called educationally subnormal, and now they're in their adult years. So we have a much greater understanding. And why is that understanding important? It's important to be able to deliver the correct interventions, help and support for families and for schools. And understanding is very useful for families. It's psychoeducation for families about understanding the differences in a young person, how to manage them, and how to enable them to get the best out of their life. So that has changed. Now, this has led to the increasing requirement for diagnoses. So this has led to where children would just be classed in these groups, to the increasing requirement for diagnoses. However, as this increase for requirement for diagnoses has occurred, funding for services hasn't followed suit. So funding for services has not followed in the same way. These conditions are lifelong, so the neurodevelopmental conditions are lifelong and tend to affect people for the whole of their lives. So the process in doing a diagnosis is set out by something called the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, NICE, which is a governmental organisation that says that the diagnostic process should follow this. The diagnostic process should include a variety of professionals, so it's not just one professional who does it. It's not just information from psychiatrist, a child psychiatrist, but it's got to be information from school, information from parent carer. It's got to be another professional, so nursing, occupational therapy, speech and language therapist, to assist in that diagnostic process. So you need something called a multi-agency, multidisciplinary team to do that, with some standardized tests to do it. So there's no blood test that says you can have autism. There's no quick checklist that says you can have autism. It's part of this multi-agency, multidisciplinary process to get a diagnosis. So as you can imagine, that's quite difficult to coordinate. Quite a lot of funding is required to do that. So the funding going into it is not increased with the greater understanding and the requirement to that, which has led to these waiting lists in different areas. It's quite complicated how funding for health services is done across the UK, even though we have a National Health Service. It's commissioned in each area. And it tends to be around what resources are already there rather than creating resources to meet a need. So that's one of the factors that's led to this increase in waiting times and waiting lists. Then we've had another whammy, which is COVID, which has further increased that, because a lot of these assessments were done face-to-face. A lot of these assessments are undertaken in school time, and all of this has been impacted by the COVID restrictions, which again has led to this increase in waiting lists. Our service, myself, we were involved, particularly last year, around the use of telemedicine in doing that. So online assessment and how to improve online assessments in autism spectrum disorder assessments. But again, this still takes time and a lot of resources to get up and going that leads to the length of these waiting lists.
for someone to be diagnosed with autism, they have to have those symptoms or difficulties in communication across different settings. I know we assess at home, at school, and see what kind of social environment, like friends, etc., that they have as well.
Yeah, as you said, we'll use some of the standardized tests. We'll look into other factors because you said these conditions often exist with a lot of other conditions, comorbidity, multimorbidity. So, we have to be aware of that, looking for any underlying genetic conditions, looking for other mental health conditions as part of that process.
So where can someone who wants to know more about autism or seek support, are there any NGOs or any charity organizations they can link up with, or even NHS sources?
So within the NHS, your first port of call would generally be either your school. The school SENCO, Special Educational Needs Coordinator, should have an idea of the referral process and who can help make a referral. Then, if not, your GP should be aware of the referral process and how a referral is done, or your paediatrician if your child is under a paediatrician. So that's kind of NHS and education. Additionally, education-wise, on the local authority website, there will be a section on special educational needs. So if you want to find information about your local structures and how things are done, go onto the local authority website, and there will be a section under special educational needs that again will direct you to support organisations who can assist on that. So again, that's specific to each local area. Within the UK, we have the National Autistic Society, which is a big society that offers a lot of support and advice out there, and gives support and advice on diagnoses, after diagnoses, what are the local support group, goes through all those kind of factors. And I can give you that website if you want. I'll look at it, which is www.autism.org.uk. So www.autism.org.uk. So that is the recommended website. That's what we would share with parents and families for information pre-diagnosis, how to get a diagnosis, how to get support after a diagnosis.
So we're nearly at the end of our time, Dr. Mockett. Thank you very much for being on the show and taking your time out to share your knowledge with us.
Thank you very much, Hassan. I hope it's been useful.
Definitely. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. You can listen to the full episode on melodicdistraction.com, where we also have some music accompanying our themes and discussions. Please do stay in touch with us on our Instagram, which is nirvana.principle. Bye for now.